Hello friends and welcome to another Nostalgia Talk bonus looking back on yet another nostalgic Halloween production. This time around I'm once again looking back on the adventures of the Mystery Inc. gang with the third direct-to-video film in the series, Scooby Doo and the Alien Invaders. This was one of my favorite Scooby Doo related things as a kid, and it's one that I still hold in my memory now. So let's kick back, have some Scooby snacks, and see what Scooby and the gang are up to in this one. Unlike Zombie Island and the Witch's Ghost, this one doesn't start with the Mystery Inc. gang. The first thing that we see is a shot of the entire galaxy, making our way to Earth. Once we arrive there, at the headquarters of South, search for alien life forms, a man named Max gets a very loud reading coming into his headphones. He tells his coworker Laura, and she notices that the reading is at a very high number on their chart. But just as their colleague Steve arrives, it is no longer on their meter and Max can't hear it. Max and Laura are both determined to figure out what it could be, but Steve tells them that they should get some rest. But they decide not to give up, and Steve has a listen as the reading returns. Finally, we see the Mystery Inc. gang, with Shaggy driving the Mystery Machine on a dark and windy night through the desert, but the loud music that he and Scooby Doo are listening to makes it hard for Velma, Fred, and Daphne to sleep in the back seat. Velma asks them to turn it down, and Shaggy says, "Like we were gonna wake you up anyway." As usual, Shaggy and Scooby want to stop to get some food. Fred points out that they just had dinner 2 hours prior, to which Shaggy responds that in dog time, it's been 14 hours. Because it's so dark and stormy, Shaggy doesn't realize that he's driving onto restricted government property. The road starts to get bumpy and the sound of the wind gets louder and louder. But actually, the sound is coming from a UFO soaring above the van. The lights beaming down causes the Mystery Machine to go a bit off course, crashing into a cactus and releasing the airbags. The gang get out of the van and the UFO has disappeared, as Fred, Velma, and Daphne start to question what it could have been. Just then, the Mystery Machine breaks down and leaves the gang stuck in the middle of nowhere. But as luck would have it, Fred spots what he believes is a town close to the area. Shaggy finds it a bit spooky to walk across the desert in the middle of the night, and Fred says, "Well, I'm not gonna carry ya." Fearing rattle rakes, Scooby-Doo and Shaggy stay behind to keep watch of the Mystery Machine, and Fred, Daphne, and Velma head off. Once they leave, Shaggy and Scooby decide to dig into a box of Scooby snacks while on guard, but there's only one left. The pair fight over who's gonna have it until it rolls out of their hands. So they decide to share it, but then a jackalope finds it and takes it for itself. Shaggy and Scooby chase the jackalope over to the other side of the desert, with Shaggy climbing over and Scooby crawling under the fence, but the jackalope escapes into a cave. Shaggy and Scooby follow the jackalope, but when they look inside, they notice some kind of glow in the cave, as two figures appear behind them. Shaggy feels as if there's something creepy behind them, so Scooby has a look and confirms that whatever it is real reepy. The pair look behind themselves as the figures come out of the shadows and are revealed to be aliens, frightening Shaggy and Scooby, and the two run off in fear, with the aliens chasing them on their... Is that supposed to be some kind of a futuristic Segway? It looks a little bit like a Zamboni. The aliens eventually pass Shaggy and Scooby, who are disguised as cactuses, but once they get away, they realize that they were being fooled, and they chase them again all around the desert. Just like in the last two movies, this is done as a chase scene with the Scooby-Doo theme song being played, this time by Jennifer Love Hewitt. Still trying to escape the aliens, Shaggy and Scooby run into a small diner where they are reunited with the rest of the gang. Shaggy tells them about the aliens and Fred looks outside, but he doesn't see any aliens. Shaggy and Scooby describe to the others what they look like, but get distracted when they notice donuts on the counter. According to waitress Dottie, Shaggy and Scooby aren't the only ones who claim to have seen aliens. Velma asks Dottie if she's ever seen them, but Dottie says that all she's ever seen is just lights, and also hears strange noises at night. But then she introduces the group to a regular at the diner named Lester, who claims to have been abducted by aliens. The diner owner and cook Sergio tells Lester to either keep it down or leave, and tells the group that Lester is lying about his experience with aliens. Sergio tells the group about the disappearance of cattle in town, and that no one was able to figure out how they disappeared, with some townspeople moving. Fred and Daphne and Velma go to speak with Lester about his stories, and Shaggy and Scooby stay behind to dig into Sergio's food. "Sergio, I guarantee before closing time you won't have a restaurant left." Lester confirms that the aliens looked exactly like the ones that Shaggy and Scooby described. He tells them the story about how it all happened. While over at Scorpion Ridge, the same desert that Shaggy and Scooby discovered the aliens, Lester spotted a light coming from behind him. As it got brighter, he blacked out and woke up inside of a spaceship, where the aliens have strapped Lester to what he describes as a cold metal table and attached wires to him. Lester doesn't remember much of the experience and woke up at his house the next morning. Fred asks if anyone else in town has experienced this, and Lester says that he doesn't know, and if they do, they don't talk about it. Lester speaks so passionately that he causes Dottie to drop food off of her tray. It's a good thing that Scooby Doo is there, but before he can get to it, he gets beaten by Shaggy. Dottie calls out to Sergio, "I finally met someone who likes your cooking." Does Shaggy even care that it's been on the floor? Jeez, that boy will eat anything. Fred asks Lester if he has any proof of his supposed alien abduction, and Lester tells the gang that he has pictures. Velma asks if they can see the pictures, and Lester takes the gang to his house, which has a lot of alien and UFO stuff around it. Fred and Daphne look at the newspaper articles on the wall reporting on UFO sightings, and Fred asks Lester if he has shared his stories with the media. Lester confirms that he has, but the media has brushed it off. Fred asks Lester about his pictures, and Lester shows them to the gang, but it turns out that Lester's a landscape artist, and his pictures are just paintings, and that he uses his art to show people how dangerous the area really is, but he mostly gets ignored by the locals. Daphne looks through the paintings, and while she's disappointed that they aren't actual photographs of aliens, she does discover a painting of a UFO similar to the one that was flying over the Mystery Machine earlier. In that painting is also satellite dishes set up by South, which are right outside of Lester's house. According to Lester, once the satellite dishes were built, that's when the aliens appeared. Fred thinks that Lester's a little strange, but Velma feels as if there is a logical explanation between the satellite dishes and the sudden appearances of aliens shortly after. Lester offers to show more pictures to the rest of the gang, but knowing what they're in for, they turn it down, and Fred asks if there is a nearby hotel that they can stay at while they wait on the Mystery Machine to be repaired. Lester tells them that there is no hotel nearby at all, which makes sense because they're in the middle of nowhere, and offers the gang to sleep at his house, offering his kids' bunk beds to Daphne and Velma, the couch to Fred, and the roof to Shaggy and Scooby. Lester tosses a blanket to Shaggy and it drapes over him, with Scooby at first thinking that Shaggy is a ghost until Shaggy takes the blanket off of him. With everyone now sleeping and the house quiet, the aliens return and bring Shaggy and Scooby aboard their ship. Scooby Doo wakes up on a cold metal table, much like the one that Lester described, and comes face to face with aliens, while Shaggy is still sleeping, but he is strapped as well. Scooby manages to wake Shaggy up, and when he sees the aliens, he tries to break free, but realizes that he's trapped. One alien tells them not to fear them, and Shaggy says, "Like it's too late for that, man," as the pair shake in fear. Much like Lester's experience, the aliens attach wires to them, which only just tickle Shaggy and Scooby. Before they can ask them questions, Scooby's tail pushes a button on his table, and he is released. The aliens start to chase after him as he runs away wheeling Shaggy, but they only just keep running in circles and eventually are cornered by the aliens. One alien pulls out some kind of device that looks a bit like a taser, and Shaggy and Scooby faint. The next morning, the pair is woken up in the middle of the desert by a young woman who speaks very much like Shaggy and her dog. The young woman asks if Shaggy is okay, and Shaggy figures that perhaps he had a nightmare when he realizes where he is. Scooby Doo tries to make a move with the dog, but the dog doesn't seem interested in him. The young woman offers Shaggy some water, and she introduces herself to him as Crystal. She tells him that she's a freelance photographer and that she and her dog, named Amber, are shooting nature pictures for a magazine. Shaggy tells Crystal about the jackalope that he and Scooby spotted, and Scooby mentions the aliens to her. Upon introducing themselves to Crystal and Amber, Shaggy begins to develop a crush on Crystal, even liking the way that she talks. She says that Shaggy and Scooby have groovy names. Crystal asks if she can see where the pair saw this jackalope, and Shaggy then realizes that they need to find Fred, Daphne, and Velma. So Crystal offers to drive them in her Jeep, decorated to look like something out of the 1960s. Scooby sits down next to Amber and smiles at her, but she doesn't show any interest in him. Even when he puts his arm around her, she just takes it right off. While sitting in the front seat, Shaggy stumbles upon a box of Amber's dog biscuits. Crystal allows Shaggy to feed one to Scooby, but Shaggy takes it for himself. Like I said, that boy will eat anything. Meanwhile, Lester walks Fred, Daphne, and Velma to Sergio's diner. Daphne feels as if Shaggy and Scooby have already beaten them there, but the booths are all free. Dottie comes over and welcomes the gang and asks Fred if she had any dreams about him. Just saying, last time someone had a crush on Fred, she turned out to be a demonic werecat. Maybe Dottie's an alien. But Sergio comes back with, "If you were in that dream, it'd be a nightmare." The gang seats themselves, still wondering where Shaggy and Scooby could be. But right away, Velma spots Crystal dropping them off in her Jeep. Velma wonders who they're with, and Lester recognizes her, telling them that she's some kind of nature photographer who's been hanging around since last week. Shaggy and Scooby come in and join the rest of the gang. Daphne asks who the young lady was, and Shaggy, while just staring into space, tells them all about her. Even Scooby is smitten with Amber. Daphne and Velma just chuckle to themselves. Dottie comes by to take the gang's orders, and very surprisingly, Shaggy and Scooby are not hungry at all. Fred asks, "Are you guys serious?" Velma says, "I think they're seriously in LOVE. With Shaggy and Scooby not hungry, Lester orders 4 ranch breakfasts for the rest of them. As Dottie walks away, Shaggy starts to picture Crystal and sings about her. I don't think I've ever seen a musical number in any of these Scooby Doo movies before. This actually was one of the first, or maybe even the first, Scooby Doo thing I ever saw as a kid, and I remember this musical number very fondly. It kind of goes something like, how groovy, just us two, so groovy. Don't forget Scooby Doo! It's cute when Shaggy pictures him and Crystal having a baby who looks very much like Shaggy, with Scooby Doo and Amber even having puppies of their own. He ends his fantasy by sharing a kiss with Crystal, but then it's revealed that he's actually kissing Scooby Doo. I'm just gonna assume that Scooby Doo was having a very similar fantasy about Amber, but they snap out of it when Daphne and Velma start laughing. Daphne asks Shaggy where the pair met Crystal and Amber, and Shaggy tells the gang that they actually found them in the middle of the desert. Fred asks why they were there, and then Shaggy remembers that he and Scooby Doo were abducted by aliens. Lester asks them some questions about their experience, but Shaggy doesn't remember much, other than just waking up on a spaceship surrounded by them. As the gang talks amongst themselves, Sergio starts to get suspicious about them, but Dottie just brushes it off. Fred starts to doubt whether or not Shaggy and Scooby actually saw aliens, but because of the UFO from before, Daphne thinks it could be possible. Velma asks Shaggy and Scooby a bit more about their experience, but Shaggy still doesn't remember much before meeting Crystal. Then he starts to stare into space again. Lester thinks that it's alien mind control, and Velma agrees that, yes, it is mind control, but not from aliens. Fred, Daphne, and Velma leave the diner and part ways with Lester as Shaggy and Scooby come out looking all dolled up as the gang make their way to a garage. When they find one, they meet Buck, a mechanic who found the mystery machine out by Scorpion Ridge and discovered that the radiator's shot. Buck questions why the gang was out that way, and Daphne starts to answer that they got lost, but before she can finish, Buck interrupts her and tells the gang that he'll tow the mystery machine into the garage and work on it once he has time. The gang leaves and talks amongst themselves about how rude Buck acted towards them as a South van comes their way. Max, the South scientist who discovered the reading at the start, introduces himself to the Mystery Inc. gang and tells them that he spotted the mystery machine. Fred introduces Max to the gang, and Velma starts to talk to him about his work. Max tells the gang that they mostly just listen to static, which she finds boring. Velma asks Max if he gives tours, and apparently, no one's ever asked. But Max takes Velma up on that. The gang helps Max bring oil onto his truck for the satellite dishes, but before they leave, Crystal and Amber arrive so that Shaggy and Scooby can show them where they saw the jackalope. So Shaggy and Scooby take off with Crystal and Amber, and Fred, Daphne, and Velma head off with Max. At the desert at Scorpion Ridge, Shaggy takes Crystal to where he and Scooby Doo saw the jackalope, which Shaggy has a hard time describing. Scooby, on the other hand, picks a small bouquet of flowers for Amber, and she gives him a lick and accepts them, making Scooby very excited. Shaggy picks a bouquet of flowers for Crystal, but he doesn't realize that he picked up a spider with them as the spider crawls into Shaggy's shirt, which frightens Shaggy to the point where he drops the flowers and runs around trying to get it off. When he finally gets rid of it, he gives Crystal one flower. Shaggy and Scooby lead Crystal to where they saw the jackalope, and Crystal climbs over the fence and Amber crawls underneath, much like Shaggy and Scooby did earlier to chase the jackalope. Shaggy is a bit frightened to follow them as that's where they saw the aliens, but with just a look, Crystal and Amber talk Scooby and Shaggy into following them. Meanwhile, at the South Station, Max introduces Fred, Daphne, and Velma to Laura and Steve, and talk to the Mystery Inc. gang about what they do. Steve and Max both find it boring, with Steve calling it the biggest collection of static in the US. Fred tells the group that the town locals believe that aliens are being attracted by their satellite dishes, but Laura refutes the claim. Steve points out that the government even sent an investigation team to look into it. As they're talking, Velma notices that their shoes have dirt and mud on them. Meanwhile, while at Scorpion Ridge, Crystal starts taking some nature pictures as Shaggy and Scooby just sit there and admire Crystal and Amber. Crystal thanks Shaggy for bringing them to the area, and Shaggy blushes, without realizing that Crystal's taken off to take more pictures. As he thinks he's still talking to Crystal, two MP officers come up behind him. Shaggy asks Crystal if she has a boyfriend, and one officer responds, "As a matter of fact, I don't." Shaggy starts to respond, but then realizes that that wasn't Crystal who answered him. He turns and notices the officers and runs away scared. Well, at least it's not aliens. Shaggy very frighteningly jumps into Crystal's arms as the MP officers catch up to them, questioning why they're there. One officer takes Crystal's camera and looks inside of it. I will say, it definitely doesn't look like the inside of an ordinary camera. One officer asks, "What kind of camera is this?" and Crystal says, "It's digital." The officers tell Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber that the area is restricted government property closed off due to investigation of alien abductions. Having had experience in that, Shaggy decides to take off, and the officers let the group off with a warning and tell them to leave and take their dogs with them. You all know what comes next. Rogs? Rare! The gang heads off and Crystal calls the officers Neanderthals. As they're leaving, the officers refer to the gang as hippies. One says to the other, "I wish we really could bust them." Once they're out, Crystal goes back to check to see if the coast is clear. That's when Crystal confesses to Shaggy that she actually is not a nature photographer. She's actually a government agent who was sent to investigate the claims of alien sightings, and also that Amber is a government-trained dog. Crystal hopes that this doesn't change Shaggy and Crystal's relationship, or Scooby and Amber's relationship. They're not bothered by this at all and agree to help Crystal and Amber on their mission. After Max shows Fred, Daphne, and Velma the South Station, Lester arrives in his truck and the gang asks for a drive to Scorpion Ridge. Lester accepts and Daphne and Velma sit up front, leaving no room for Fred, so Lester has him take the back. Fred really does have bad luck with Lester. But luckily, Fred does find a hatch and he opens it so that he can talk with the rest of the gang. Velma starts to find the South scientists suspicious, noting the mud and dirt on their shoes. Fred and Daphne start to think about it as well, and Velma starts to question why they would have mud on their shoes, especially if the station is so clean. She also points out that the oil that Max bought for the satellite dishes is the wrong kind of oil for hydraulics. Fred agrees with that, and then Daphne agrees with Velma that they could be up to something, and even Lester agrees. As Lester's truck takes off from the station, Max, Laura, and Steve notice that they're heading to the direction of Scorpion Ridge. Steve tells Max to call it in, and Max picks up a phone. Over that way, Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber start to hunt for clues. Shaggy takes Crystal to the cave where the jackalope went in, and that Scooby and Shaggy discovered the aliens. Shaggy tells the story to Crystal, with the glow that they saw before the aliens appeared being their first clue. But just then, they can hear the MP officers heading their way. With Lester and the rest of the gang still on a bumpy road to Scorpion Ridge, they notice Buck, the mechanic from before, by the flowers. They stop to ask him if he's looked at the mystery machine yet, and Buck very aggressively says that he has not, and will work on it in the afternoon. Daphne and Velma then start to have suspicions on him. Even Lester doesn't trust Buck. Meanwhile, the MPs make their way to the cave, but get startled by what appears to be a rattlesnake. But it was only Scooby Doo using his tail as a rattle, with Shaggy making the sound, having made their way into the cave with Crystal and Amber as a way to hide from the MPs. But just as Shaggy gets lost in Crystal's eyes, a real snake slithers its way on Shaggy's hand. Shaggy at first believes that it's Scooby, but then Shaggy picks it up and the pair run away. Crystal and Amber follow after, assuring them that the snake is harmless. Lester drops Fred, Daphne, and Velma at Scorpion Ridge, warning them about the MPs, calling them meaner than a bull with a toothache. After Lester leaves, Fred starts to have suspicions about Lester, noticing green paint on his hands. Daphne reminds him that Lester is a painter after all. Hey, we can make Fred a suspect. He had green paint poured all over him when he was rattling in the back of Lester's truck. Daphne wonders why Velma wanted Lester to drop them off at Scorpion Ridge, and Velma wants to find out what the South scientists are up to and find evidence at the gorge on the other side of the fence. Inside of the cave, as Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber make their way around, Crystal spots a glow up ahead. The very same glow that Shaggy and Scooby saw before they came face to face with the aliens. The pair are a bit anxious to head that way, but Crystal and Amber already do. So Shaggy and Scooby, not wanting to be alone in a dark cave, follow them, and as soon as they get there, they spot something. But we don't get to see what it is just yet as Fred, Daphne, and Velma make their way to the bottom of the gorge. But Velma's theory is proven false as the river is completely dry. But then Daphne spots tracks and the gang follows them to piles of wet rocks. And right behind them are more tracks which lead to a cave. As they walk down, Daphne figures that it's a mine and Fred stumbles upon a can of oil, recognizing it from when they were helping Max load it onto his truck. As they head further down the cave, they discover mining equipment and a jackhammer covered in gold. In the next scene, it's revealed that Shaggy and Scooby found the gold, but as they start gathering some of it and discuss their plans for it, Crystal notes that somebody else discovered it first, with piles of gold in a wheelbarrow with mining equipment around it, discouraging Shaggy and Scooby. But just then, the aliens return and chase Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber away from the gold. On the other side of the coin, Fred, Daphne, and Velma get their hands on the gold, but likewise are chased away by aliens and the MP officers. This is done in a chase scene very similar to classic Scooby Doo, where everyone is running in groups and come in and out of different openings. Eventually, Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber come to the edge of a cliff as the MP officers close in on them, but the gang falls off the cliff. And the aliens capture Fred, Daphne, and Velma with a net and lift them up higher with a crane above a large hole. One of the aliens looks like they're celebrating, kind of like victory is mine. Speaking in alienese, or whatever the hell language aliens speak in, the aliens send the MPs off and one says to the gang, "Silence, Earthlings! You should not have interfered." Velma responds, "You can give up the hokey alien charade now, Steve." Realizing that the jig is up, and before the Mystery Inc. gang can get to it first, the aliens unmask themselves, revealing Steve, Laura, and Max. Well, that's better than demonic werecats who only want the Mystery Inc. gang for their own immortality, or a lying warlock who used them to take over the world. At least we're back to classic Scooby Doo. Upon realizing that the South scientists are behind this scheme, Daphne and Velma call them out for keeping the gold mine to themselves instead of doing their job, but Max attests that when he discovered the mine, he was doing his job. He tells the gang that while he was looking for where to place another satellite dish, he stumbled upon the opening to the cave, which had been hidden by bushes. Later on, he brought Laura and Steve along so that they could explore it and figure out what's going on. While searching around, they discovered the gold, and since nobody else knew about it, they decided to keep it for themselves. According to Steve, it was originally a mine in the 1800s that was abandoned before the miners could discover what the South scientists found. Fun fact, just like Snakebite in Scooby Doo on Zombie Island, Steve's voice is done by the one and only Jedi Master himself, Mark Hamill. I find it funny that Mark is best known for playing a character that is known for basically protecting the galaxy, and in this he's voicing a character who goes as far as to disguise himself as an alien to frighten people away. As the scientists continue to tell the Mystery Inc. gang their story, Laura explains that the MPs are fake and they were hired by the South scientists to keep people away from their gold, pretending that it's government property. Meanwhile, after falling off of the cliff, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber wake up seemingly unharmed, and Scooby realizes that he landed on Shaggy's head, which is now buried into the ground. Once they look around, they realize that they've come to yet another cliff. Shaggy yells, "Zoinks!" and it echoes all the way down. As the South scientists get ready to drop Fred, Daphne, and Velma into the hole, they still have some questions. Daphne remembers that the townspeople have seen spaceships, but that was only just a helicopter dressed up to look like a spaceship, with the inside of it being built by them. And as Sergio mentioned before, sometime before the apparent sighting of aliens in the town, local cattle went missing. Max has an explanation for that, saying that they stole them and it contributes to their wealth in addition to the gold. Hold on, if they're the aliens, then what the f*** was the reading that Max picked up at the beginning? Anyway, Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber start to head away from the cliff but get cornered by the fake MPs. Shaggy and Scooby try to scare them off by using Kung Fu, but the MPs just laugh at them. But Shaggy and Scooby don't give up as the officers get closer and closer to them. Not knowing what else to do, in an unexpected twist, Crystal and Amber transform into aliens, which frightens the MPs off. Shaggy and Scooby are confused by this as Crystal and Amber return to their previous form, congratulating Shaggy and Scooby for frightening the MPs away. Then they hear Daphne screaming, and the gang heads off to find the rest of the Mystery Inc. gang. Steve is ready to drop the gang into the hole and says to them, "Nothing personal, you just know too much." Fred says under his breath, "Yeah, that's always our problem." At least he didn't call them meddling kids. Once Steve lowers the net into the hole, the MP officers run by, telling the scientists that they saw aliens. Steve, Laura, and Max turn to their direction and refute the claim, and Fred tries to escape. Just then, Shaggy, Scooby, Crystal, and Amber show up, and the MPs nervously point out Crystal and Amber as the aliens to the scientist. Laura says to them, "You two have been breathing the fumes from the equipment for too long." Noticing that they're not aliens, Steve has the MPs capture the rest of the gang, and the MPs brush off Crystal and Amber's alien form as a trick. As they corner the gang, Shaggy and Scooby once again try to fight them away using Kung Fu. Fred manages to escape the net and pulls it to the ground, freeing Daphne and Velma. Shaggy and Scooby's Kung Fu doesn't scare the officers and they capture and threaten them. But Crystal and Amber return to their alien forms, frightening the officers, the South scientists, and Shaggy and Scooby. Max and the MPs run away frightened, and Laura wants to follow them, but Steve surmises that if they capture the aliens, it'll be worth more than gold. Laura agrees with him and the two head off. While Max and the MPs back away from the aliens, Amber grabs a girder and wraps Max and the MPs in it. But then Steve and Laura show up with a bulldozer and chase Crystal and Amber with it. While trying to get away, Crystal trips on a jackhammer as Steve and Laura get closer and closer, but Amber is strong enough to push it. Steve feels as if he can handle this himself and has Laura help Max and the MPs. Not knowing that the aliens are actually Crystal and Amber, Shaggy and Scooby hide behind another bulldozer. Once Fred, Daphne, and Velma are free, Daphne calls to Shaggy to alert him that the aliens are actually Crystal and Amber. Shaggy doesn't believe them until Velma points out Crystal's necklace. Laura tries to break Max and the MPs free without much luck, but then Shaggy and Scooby arrive with the second bulldozer. Scooby stands up front holding a pipe that he pushes into Steve's bulldozer, stopping him from attacking Crystal and Amber, and Shaggy crashes into Steve. Scooby is catapulted to a water tower, and he uses the pipe to poke a hole into it as Max and the MPs, while still wrapped in the girder, try to catch up to them, but get stopped when water from the tower pours onto them. Meanwhile, Shaggy can't stop the bulldozer and crashes into the carts that Steve, Laura, and Max were using in their alien disguises, revealed to be scooters that they redesigned. Laura hides behind a few oil drums, but Shaggy crashes into them and Laura gets covered in oil. Steve and Laura run away, and now that Fred, Daphne, and Velma are free of the net, Fred uses it to capture Steve and Laura. Finally, Shaggy manages to stop the bulldozer as Crystal and Amber return to their previous forms. Shaggy asks about the alien forms, and Crystal confesses that she is a government agent, but from another world. Amber also reveals that she can speak, and the two were sent from their planet to investigate television signals that were sent from Earth in the 1960s, which is why they're disguised in hippie outfits. Crystal says, "We thought all Earthlings dressed this way." At that moment, their mothership, the very same one that the gang saw at the start, comes to pick up Crystal and Amber. Well, that explains the signal that Max picked up. Shaggy and Scooby say their goodbyes to Crystal and Amber, and Fred gets emotional. Crystal and Amber return to their alien forms and are taken aboard the ship, and Steve, Laura, Max, and the MPs are arrested. Lester's disappointed that there were never any aliens, but Max insists that there were. But Steve and Laura don't think that anyone will believe them because they don't have proof. Then Lester tells the scientist that he has pictures, and he takes the detectives handling the case to his house. I think they're going to be pretty disappointed. Max, Steve, Laura, and the MPs are hopeful that this is just the evidence that they need, and feel that their luck is changing as they're taken away. So, did the detectives, not get Max and the MPs out of the girders? Look at them in the back of the truck. They're still wrapped. Finally, Buck arrives with the mystery machine now repaired. Fred pays Buck and asks him why he was in the desert. Buck reveals to Fred, Daphne, and Velma that he collects pressed flowers and keeps them in a scrapbook. But he wants to keep it a secret as he doesn't want anyone to walk all over him. Buck takes off, and the gang spots Shaggy and Scooby looking up at the sky, feeling sad. But they quickly snap out of it when Velma presents them with a box of Scooby snacks, and they argue over it as the gang leaves Scorpion Ridge. To close, I would like to mention that like how Scooby Doo on Zombie Island was dedicated to Don Messick, the original voice of Scooby Doo, Scooby Doo in the Alien Invaders was dedicated to Mary Kay Bergman. Mary was the voice of Daphne at the time, as well as the original voice of Timmy Turner for The Fairly OddParents, the Disney character Snow White at the time, and various characters on South Park. Mary passed away shortly after Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, and this one, Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders, was released after her passing, so the movie was dedicated to her memory. So that's all I've got to say about Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders. This is going to be the last Scooby-Doo retrospective I do this year. Maybe I'll do more next Halloween, but for this year there are 2 more Halloween retrospectives coming your way really soon. See you then.